When you think of stress, what do you think of? A big test, paying your rent on time, being at a large gathering, changing a flat tire? Stress can take many forms and also has notable impacts on our health and physiological states. So that's what we'll be talking about in this lecture, what stress is and how it impacts our health. Let's get through some definitions first. So stress is a type of response that typically involves unpleasant states such as anxiety or tension. Stressors are things in our environment that are perceived as threatening or demanding and is generally what leads to our stress. Coping responses are our attempts to avoid, escape from, or minimize a stressor. Coping responses help us also just handle our stress in general. So there are two types of stress. Eustress is the stress of positive events. For example, you might experience eustress when you are admitted to the college you really want to attend, or if you're preparing for a party that you're looking forward to. There are still changes in your body going on as you prepare for these events, even if they're positive events. Distress is the stress of negative events, and that's what we are mostly thinking of and referring to when we talk about stress. However, the stress of negative events and the stress of positive events are predictive of our health outcomes. And obviously, some events are more stressful than others. So, this is a picture of the student stress scale. It's a validated measure that assesses the amounts of stress that are associated with changes or just events going on in your life. So, we can see that the amount of stress really varies across different events. And even generally positive ones like having a new girlfriend or boyfriend or getting married have notable amounts of stress since they are still life adjustments that are occurring, and that also relates to general changes in responses physiologically as well. So there are different types of stressors. We have our major life stressors, which are changes or disruptions that strain a central part of our lives. So even if it's a change that you're excited about, like maybe having your first child, this could still be considered a major life stressor because it's changing a lot of how you are, of your like regular routine and how you generally function. Natural disasters and trauma are also very common forms of major life stressors. Daily hassles refer to small day-to-day irritations and annoyances like waiting in traffic, living in a highly populated or polluted area, having your Wi-Fi cut out during a Zoom meeting or a Zoom lecture, or experiencing conflicts with coworkers. So over time, daily hassles can cause our coping responses to weaken by kind of wearing down our resources that we use to handle daily hassles. If you're like always having to deal with conflicts with a coworker, eventually it's going to get to you and you might not be able to cope with that stress as well as you normally would. So, stress has physiological components. This might be something that you already know or think about, like when you maybe get like a stress headache or your muscles are really tense, or you notice that your breathing changes. So, we'll be talking a little bit about that now. So, stressors activate two sites within our body. We have the fast acting sympathetic nervous system, and the other kind of slower one that is known as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. For now, we'll just be calling it the HPA axis. So, the HPA axis is one of the systems that's activated by stressors, and it leads to a release of hormones, and these hormones can have impacts on our bodies. But before I go into that, I'm going to play this video that gives us a rundown of how the HPA axis is activated and kind of the steps and the impacts it has on our body.
Adrenal, or HPA, axis is best known for its role in our body's reaction to stress. The HPA axis includes a group of hormone-secreting glands from the nervous and endocrine systems. the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal glands. The hypothalamus is a small neuroendocrine structure situated just above the brainstem that controls the release of hormones from the pituitary gland, a hormone-secreting gland that sits just below the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland can release hormones into the bloodstream to reach a variety of targets. In the case of the HPA axis, hormones released from the pituitary gland travel down to the kidneys and influence the secretion of hormones from endocrine glands called the adrenal glands, which sit on top of the kidneys. The primary function of the HPA axis is to regulate the stress response. When we experience something stressful, the hypothalamus releases a hormone called corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH. CRH signals the pituitary gland to secrete a hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, into the bloodstream. ACTH travels down to the adrenal glands where it prompts the release of a hormone called cortisol from the cortex or outer layer of the adrenal glands. The release of cortisol causes a number of changes that help the body to deal with stress. For example, it helps to mobilize energy like glucose, so the body has enough energy to cope with a prolonged stressor. When cortisol levels in the blood get high, this is sensed by receptors in areas of the brain like the hypothalamus and hippocampus, which leads to the shutting off of the stress response through what is known as a negative feedback mechanism.
Alright, so due to stressors, hormones are released through our HPA axis. And these hormones, which include cortisol, can have long-term impacts on organs even after those stressors are removed or we're not facing those stressors anymore. The hormones, as a result of excessive and chronic stress, can lead to difficulties with our memory and can even damage neurons. So, in particular, excess amounts of cortisol have been found to damage neurons, and that's pretty crucial to our brain functioning. So, this is just one example of how chronic stress and activation of the HPA axis can lead to some negative health outcomes. Highly stressful experiences can affect behaviors across generations. Research has found that mother rats' stress may be passed down to offspring through epigenetics or the changing of gene expression because of environmental effects. In this study that I'm referring to, and that's also included in the textbook, rats were exposed to unpredictable stress that led to physiological changes in their brains. Then the offspring of those rats showed abnormalities in their fear learning and showed a lot of physiological responses to stress once they were adults. So this is just one example of how increased stress in mothers or in parents can be passed down to their offspring. In humans, researchers have been focusing more on how stressful events and traumas have impacts on people's health and their descendants' health as well. Part of the assignments for this week include listening to 2 short podcasts that introduce this topic. Specifically, the podcast will talk about the stressors of trauma and racism and how that can impact generations down the line, and that can also explain health disparities as well. So I just want to acknowledge that some of these episodes or parts of these episodes may be difficult to listen to for some people, as they both discuss aspects of the Holocaust and racism in America. So if it gets difficult, I definitely acknowledge that and reach out to me if you're not able to finish these assignments. But for those who are able to get through it, I just want to say that these episodes highlight some really important work that psychologists and other scientists are doing, and I think it's important to get an idea of this as well. No. Oops, sorry, technical difficulties. All right. So now we're going to move on to talking about general adaptation syndrome. So the general adaptation syndrome was proposed by Hans Selye, and it kind of helped talk about the patterns within our body that happen in response to stress related to foreign organisms like infections and illnesses, and kind of what our body does when we're faced with illnesses and diseases. So there are three different stages: the alarm stage, the resistance stage, and exhaustion. And so the alarm stage is the period of time where our body is reacting to emergencies, and that can help us prepare to fight or flight, essentially. During this time, our stress resistance goes down a bit and our immune system does weaken, but then our immune system kind of kicks in and our body begins to fight back and sustain ourselves against the stressor or like the virus in this example. And so our defenses are really high up. We're really able to resist a lot of stress. But over time, our bodies get exhausted, and so our organs weaken, and our systems sort of fail. And so this model really helps us see that our bodies are able to adapt to short-term stressors, but over time, prolonged or chronic stress can really impair our health, and our body just can't always support us during some of these stressors, over time at least. Okay, so we're going to talk about the fight or flight responses right now. So imagine that someone steals your friend's lunch money, and without thinking, you try to stick up for your friend, and you yell at the bully who stole your friend's lunch money. As the bully approaches you, you get intimidated and stressed. You think of two options: either you fight the bully or you run away. In that moment, your body's undergoing a lot of different physiological changes and responses to prepare for that attack. These responses include increased heart rate, a redistribution of your blood supply. You might feel your face getting really warm or your body getting warm as your blood is rushing throughout your body. Your eyes are probably opened really wide and you're trembling and sweating. So these are these are changes in your body that occur to help you prepare for how to deal with this attack. And less immediate functions like digestion or rest are postponed so that your body can really address this immediate stressor. So this is what's going on during that commonly known fight or flight response that you've probably heard of. Much of the research on the fight or flight responses have been predominantly conducted on males, which might limit the generalizability of this phenomenon. So females have been historically excluded from this research, mostly because there were concerns that the influences of female hormone cycles and menstrual cycles might have or might complicate the patterns of physiological responses to stressful situations. This concern that the fight or flight response might not be generalizable to everyone made researchers wonder whether males and females respond differently to stressors. And they argued that females protect and care for offspring as well as create bonds with others to reduce risks and handle stressors, as opposed to engaging in the fight or flight responses. So this tendency or this response has been coined as the tend and befriend response in females in particular, and this may be due to oxytocin. Oxytocin is the hormone that's related to attachment and bonding, and it appears to be particularly important to stress responses among females. So because oxytocin levels tend to be higher in females, this might help explain the biological mechanism for why tend and befriend responses are seen more often among females than in males. I do want to highlight that there are some criticisms of evolutionary psychology perspectives like this one, as they do often really promote gender determinism. And so there are some criticisms to this theory or to evolutionary psychology perspectives in general, and that might just be something to keep in mind as you kind of digest these different responses. Okay, so we've learned a little bit about how stress impacts our body. So stress also disrupts our immune systems. So, stress reduces our ability or the ability of our immune systems to resist viruses. Our immune system is our body's mechanism for dealing with invading microorganisms, bacteria, and viruses. Studies have found that people who reported having higher levels of stress before being exposed to a cold virus developed worse cold symptoms and had higher viral counts than people who reported to be less stressed before being exposed to the cold virus. So this diagram here from the textbook shows us that the percentage of subjects who delivered colds was really increasing as a function of the number of reported psychological stressors experienced. And just a quick check-in. So according to the results of this research, would you say that students are more likely to be susceptible to colds during spring break or final exams week? Maybe take a second to pause the video while you think about this response. Um, and the answer is students would be more susceptible to colds during final exams based off of this evidence because final exams week tends to be more stressful than spring break is. Stress is also linked to an increased risk in heart disease, and certain personality traits are also related to how, or certain personality traits that are related to how people handle stress are also linked to increased risk in heart disease. Studies have shown that people who were competitive, achievement oriented, aggressive, hostile, impatient, and really time pressed or deadline oriented were more likely to develop coronary heart disease compared to people who did not show those traits. So, more recent studies have found that hostility in particular is predictive of heart disease, and chronic hostility, or basically continuously displaying hostile behaviors and aggressive behaviors, are more likely to lead to more wear and tear on the heart and kind of tire your heart out earlier, and that can lead to some impairments in your heart functioning. Physiological effects of stress on the heart also exist. So, immediate stress decreases blood flow. Decreases blood flow and impacts how well blood vessels expand and distribute blood across the body. So if this continues repeatedly over time, where you're consistently being exposed to different stress or even the same stress, the heart is more likely to get overworked and fail as a result of higher blood pressure, constricted blood vessels, greater plaque buildup. And so these things can really decrease the heart's ability to function. So not only does immediate stress or chronic stress affect heart functioning, but also personality traits that are related to how we handle stress are also predictive of some heart difficulties. Coping can help us reduce the negative health effects of stress. Coping helps us deal with stress as well as the negative health effects that can come along with stress. One of the main methods of coping includes cognitive appraisals, or how we are interpreting our thoughts and events around us. So we use cognitive appraisals to think about and manage our feelings more realistically and objectively. We use primary appraisals to decide whether stimuli are actually stressful or not. If we do deem them as being stressful, then we use secondary appraisals, where we determine the best way to respond to the stressors and cope. So essentially, cognitive appraisals can help us prepare for stressful events or downplay them to better manage the events. Coping strategies have also been categorized into general categories of emotion-focused or problem-focused, and they can have different impacts on our health. We often use emotion-focused coping to prevent emotional responses to stress by avoiding, numbing the pain, or minimizing the stress. So if something is really stressful, like if you have to have a tough conversation with a coworker or a boss. Um, Sometimes you might avoid that stress by maybe smoking a cigarette or focusing on other activities that are more interesting or that are just going to keep your mind at ease. So this might sound a little bit familiar to some of the more ineffective strategies for regulating emotions that we talked about last week. Um, but I will say that emotion focused coping is not always ineffective, and it can actually be really helpful in situations where there are uncontrollable stressors, where using emotion focused coping actually helps you continue to function. So, just to highlight, emotion focused coping doesn't generally solve a problem or prevent the stressor from recurring. It's more about just handling some of the discomfort and stressful related emotions in the moment. Problem focused coping, however, includes steps to trying to solve a problem, like looking for solutions or weighing pros and cons. And these are strategies that are only really useful in scenarios where a person can actually do something about the situation or the stressor. So there are individual differences in coping. You may have experienced this firsthand. Maybe you get a lot more stressed out about things than your laid back, relaxed sibling. So some people some people appear to be resistant to stress. And this could be through the traits of hardiness or resilience. Hardiness is a personality trait where people show commitment to their daily activities, they view threats as challenges or as opportunities for growth, and they often feel like they're in control of their lives. Resiliency refers to being able to cope with adversity and bounce back, and people who are resilient often bounce back emotionally even when they're met with really stressful demands or situations. So, people who are high in hardiness and resiliency report having fewer negative responses to stressful events and experience positive emotions even under stress, respectively. Some researchers believe that resiliency can be strengthened, and that even if you are someone who might not start out being very resilient, you can still develop that over time. So we've talked about some ways of coping, and we've talked about ways that stress can negatively impact our health. Now we're going to talk about health benefits of positive attitudes and social supports. So Martin Seligman introduced the positive psychology movement in the late 1990s. This focus and movement was really related to understanding what makes people happy. So according to the positive psychology framework, happiness has three components: having positive emotions and pleasure, being engaged in life, and having a meaningful life. So, over time, one thing that's kind of shifted throughout this psychology movement is that there's a shift towards understanding well being, strengths, and virtues that help people thrive. So, not only focusing on happiness, but also well being has been a big theme. And I'm just gonna fix that typo. Yeah, okay, great. So, one pretty interesting finding from several studies related to positive psychology include the benefits of positive affect, or just being positive in general. Evidence suggests that being generally positive and showing positive attitudes and behaviors are associated with living longer and having enhanced immune system functioning. So this doesn't necessarily mean that being positive or happy makes you live longer. However, there's definitely a strong association. This may or may not come as a surprise to you, but having strong social networks may be beneficial to your health. This might be something that you've noticed throughout parts of the pandemic or throughout your experience in college in general. So the reason for this might be because social support can provide tangible forms of support. So, like actual like think about what it's like to handle all of your responsibilities on your own versus what it's like when a friend or a family member is assisting you. Whether that means like giving you car rides, helping out with food, um, that support that can be really impactful for your physical or mental health. Um, and then also emotional support can go a really long way and can help with coping with emotional difficulties or stress. All right. And so the buffering hypothesis proposes that when other people provide emotional support, the recipient is better able to cope with stressful events. Um, and maybe just take a second to think about how true that feels to you and whether you've noticed patterns of social support and interaction being helpful for managing stress and keeping you healthy. In addition to social support, trust is a predictor of better health. So, this might be because of higher levels of oxytocin. Trust is associated with higher levels of oxytocin. And, like we've talked about before, this is the hormone that's related to attachment, bonding, feelings of love, and um, it's also been associated with the tend-and-befriend response, where social bonds and protecting others increases during stress. So, oxytocin may also help explain the relationship between trust and health as it increases social bonds. And lastly, spirituality has been tied to better well being, as religion and spirituality may provide social and physical support via communities. It might help promote healthy lifestyle habits or even provide meaning and a purpose of life. And so that's everything for this week's modules. Yeah.